Hello everyone, welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Atlas. Today we will be talking about building him for the support role, his best role in my opinion. Now, first I want to really quickly cover his kit because that actually does, of course, as with most gods, affect how you want to be building him. And the first thing I want to talk about is his passive, the Astrolabe, right? Or the Astrolabe if you prefer that pronunciation. Now, it's really important to note that the empowered bonus damage of this, basically what happens with this, let me really quickly get into the technicals of this. This is basically a bonus auto attack that deals extra damage. However, this extra damage is not dependent upon any of his stats, it is purely dependent on his level. So in other words, out of all of the supports that I've ever talked about where I talk about, if they snag a kill by accident, it's not really a big deal. They can roll that into better defense or maybe even a little bit of early to mid-game damage. Atlas is probably the personification of that in my opinion, mostly due to this passive. With the bonus damage being purely dependent upon his level, this makes for a really impressive hard-hitting attack in the early to mid-game if he's a high enough level. Alright? Now, the important thing to note about this is you see the Astrolabe above his portrait there. I prefer Astrolabe myself, but you'll see it spinning and glowing and everything above his portrait there. That's how you know you have enough energy for your Astrolabe auto attack, right? As a result, your next auto attack, once that's, doing this, your next auto attack will be the bonus hit, like so. Boom. Now, you'll notice actually a couple of different things going on. First, this is the regular auto attack, right? 51 damage. Lovely time. Notice that these are also white numbers. This is important. And then you slap this out. Boom. Two numbers appeared. A 61 and a 98 damage. Now, why does that matter? Well, the fact that both those numbers are white actually indicates that this technically classifies as two auto attack strikes, besides the fact that it's obviously an AoE. Which is a really interesting thing. Why is this? Basically, the 98 was the AoE damage, and the 61 was the regular auto attack damage, just boosted a little bit, right? Now, we'll get into why that matters for building him in a little bit, but let me talk about his other abilities. But first, let me talk about his second ability first, Gravity Pull. Gravity Pull, very specifically, pulls enemies towards the Astrolabe, right? There's actually two different versions of this ability depending upon how far away the victim is. If they're outside of that closer line, then they only get pulled towards you. However, if they're within that first line, then guess what happens? You hold them. Very similarly to Khepri's Abduct, except for not quite as long of a time, and you pop them up after the fact. You also don't get increased protections. Now, you do have to be very careful with this because, in all honesty, just like with Khepri's Abduct, you're kind of a sitting duck. It doesn't last for as long, so you're not quite as in much risk, and again, you're playing support Atlas, so it's not really that big of a deal for you to be so dangerously exposed, but just keep that in mind before you use that ability that you aren't going to be able to do anything like your escape or anything like that. Now we talk about the second ability. We're going to go on ahead and throw the Astrolabe here. Upon impact it has a slow, and then we can also pull people in. Now in that particular case they were both outside of that inner circle that formed when I used the gravitational pull, right? If I were to hit somebody with them being inside that circle, they would be held there and popped towards you, very similarly to how it works if you're holding the Astrolabe. That's really, again, just to be specific, gravitational pull pulls the enemy towards wherever the Astrolabe is, not necessarily you. Of course, this ability here does damage and slows upon impact, and depending on your attack speed, you can use these pulses, which helps increase your energy even more since you get energy per hit of that, right? Now, keep in mind, though, that those pulses don't activate item effects, so don't expect those pulses to activate Gem of Isolation or Spirit of the Magus. Important note there. But that's generally how that ability works, and then we have this, the Dash, Kinetic Charge. Now, that circle that formed around Atlas during that basically operates to simplify it slightly, basically operates as a winged blade. Any slowed allies in that circle become cleansed of their slows and get a move speed boost. And that move speed boost ranges anywhere from 25 to 35%, so it's more substantial than winged blade and even sprint, to be honest. And you can see where it says min and max slow. For every cleansed slow you do, you increase that slow percentage by 25%. So if you cleanse 2 slows from allies, boom, now you're slowing an enemy by 75%. You can actually see here where I slow him down with that, right? And then I can also slow him with this as well. It's a lovely time. But most interesting of all is his ult. Now his ult, besides doing damage like this, is also reducing enemy protections and power. 5% per stack, each stack being a specific damage trigger. Pardon me. And of course power goes down the same amount. Now the power reduction isn't really that big of a deal. It ranges from 10 to 14%. Not really that big of a deal. Basically, for every 100 power the victim has, they're losing anywhere from 2 to 14%, depending on how many stacks they have, and I'm assuming here at this point that you have level 5 Gamma Burst. So even assuming a best case scenario where they're losing 14%, that's 14 per 100 power. Most damage dealing physical gods sit around 300 power as an average at this point. So you would be pretty consistently clearing 30 plus power, removing 30 plus power, which is okay. But what's really interesting is the protections. Now this range is anywhere from 5 to 35%. Do you know how incredibly impactful it is to remove 35% of a tank's protections? Right, oh, by the way, really quickly back to the power reduction. For magic damage dealers, they tend to sit around 800. So that's very specifically more along the lines of like 90 or so power. 100 odd power actually, doing my math in my head a little bit more. 110 I think is closer, which is actually a really respectable amount from magic damage dealers, but the physical damage you're removing 30 plus, so it's not really that big of a deal. For magic, again, most of the time if they're dealing damage, if they're a damage dealer, you're pulling away somewhere in the vicinity of 110, which is lovely. So, the protection reduction, though, that's a big deal. Let's say your laning opponent, or not your laning opponent, your victim is the enemy support, and they've got around 300 protections. Let's be a little bit optimistic here. Remove 35% of those, and now you're reducing their protections by over 100. Alright, this is a huge deal. In fact, Gamma Ray Burst is incredibly capable of helping your allies obliterate the enemy front line. And also keep in mind, you can bust out the ult and then pull some poor fool in afterwards, right? The ult just sits here. You can use other abilities at the same time. So you can pull someone in, or if you really want to, you can pull someone in with the thrown Astrolabe, the unburdened Astrolabe, and pull, kind of hold them there as well, and use your pulse when you can for added damage. But you are removing a huge amount of protections from the enemy supports, from the enemy solos. Right? Again, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail because we do have quite a bit of play here with items here. But now let's talk about itemizing Atlas. Now, unfortunately, at the time of this recording, Warflag isn't a purchasable option. It was for me a day ago. I don't know what happened. However, Warflag has been buffed. Basically, it does what Sentinel's Gift does currently, but instead of 15 health and 8 mana, it's 5 and 5. Alright. Furthermore, every 3 assists, I believe it's every 3 assists still, you get 1% move speed, 2% attack speed boost to you and allies around you for up to 6 stacks, right? Lovely time. Now, Warflag with these buffs is a must-purchase on an Atlas for a couple of reasons. Obviously, first off, the attack speed is never a bad thing. Right, your allies get to clear towers a little faster, and considering that towers are now a little bit painier to take out because of these bastions, right? The bastions are affected by abilities, don't get me entirely wrong here, but they only take damage, they can't be crowd controlled, and it's still going to be a little bit more effective to be shooting those from a distance with auto attacks. So increasing attack speed has become a little bit more important in the current meta, but equally as useful. Not only do you get the attack speed to your allies, but you get to pulse more often, right? Let me set up a hypothetical here, right? Just so you can see a difference, right? Actually, let me sell this really quick. Let me bust out this. And this is, you know, good old regular default attack speed. Everyone loves it. Grab the Shogun's Kusari, reset our cooldowns, and boom. Right? Obviously, War Flag will help with that by increasing your attack speed. I pressed the wrong button there. But you also get the move speed boost, so if you cleanse your allies with Unburden, then you are now talking about, combined with War Flag stacks, an absolutely massive increase in move speed. Do you know how quick you can get from a tier 2 tower to a jungle boss with a combination of War Flag stacks and Unburden? It's unholy. Alright, it's incredibly potent if you can get that going. It depends on assists and everything, obviously, for War Flag, but it's an incredibly potent combination. They can really get a lot done. So nowadays, as long as when War Flag comes back it remains the same, which I imagine it will, I suspect it was probably a glitch that they removed it for, War Flag is a must-buy at this particular point for Atlas. Now, we're going to temporarily throw on Eye of the Jungle just as a representation. I don't want to use Sentinel's Gift for that representation. I don't want to use any other classic support item because I feel that might be confusing for those who might just be watching with subtitles, right? Subtitles aren't exactly accurate. So, I'm going to use Eye of the Jungle as a sort of pseudo-War Flag just to keep you sort of in the loop there. But now let's talk about itemizing Atlas for support from the second item. Now, there are a bunch of options, and I really quickly want to discuss Gauntlet of Thebes really quick. Now, Gauntlet of Thebes is still a good item. It's not really changed that much, but I find it a little bit difficult to stack this fully, because if you actually waltz in here, and you actually bust out Unburden and you're using your pulse, you're going to find, unless you're paying really close attention and you're literally right standing physically here, which most Atlases aren't going to be, it's ranged for a reason, you're going to find you're going to accidentally kill a minion or two, so it tends to take a little bit longer to stack Gauntlet of Thebes than normal. You still can, just be aware of the fact that it's going to take slightly more time than you would normally expect, right? So we have that. Decent item. I do want to really quickly talk about Prophetic Cloak. Now, the trick with Prophetic Cloak is that you gain a stack of those protections based upon the damage type of the target, magic or physical. As a result, it's only worth building Prophetic Cloak if there's more than one of a given damage type. Now, in the standard team composition of 3 physical, 2 magic, one of those magic is the Guardian. They're supposed to be on the front line. They're basically getting into the line of fire intentionally. It's not terribly difficult to build up your magic protection stacks off of the Guardian to support. But they're not always there, right? So you do have to kind of, if, for example, the enemy team has 2 ranged mages, and neither of them are playing support, you might want to hold off on buying Prophetic Cloak. It's going to be a little bit harder to get those magic protection stacks, right? This is a bit more of a team-by-team basis. It also is a little bit more difficult to stack this in time for Arena and Joust, by the way, because those game modes tend to be shorter, so it's really difficult to build up these stacks on Prophetic Cloak in those specific game modes, so keep that in mind. So, there is that, right? So what do I personally prefer? Well, I have a couple of personal preferences. For most team compositions, again, we're talking 3 physical, 2 magic, my preferred is Emperor's Armor. Now, Emperor's Armor has always been really good on Atlas. Remember, you can hold people, you have 2 slows, you have the pull. Whether or not you hold somebody, you still have the pull. You have your ult to reduce their protections. They're going to be hit really hard by your towers, especially under the influence of Emperor's Armor, and most team compositions want the 60 physical protections. 300 health helps you against the magic damage you'll see early game. It's a really great second item if you're not building Gauntlet of Thebes or Prophetic Cloak. And between the 3 of these items, if I'm not building Prophetic Cloak, I'm probably going Emperor's Armor, to be honest. Really fond of this. I'm going to go on ahead and throw on Prophetic Cloak here for the example, but we're going to immediately afterwards put on the lovely Emperor's Armor. And you, again, want to be building Emperor's Armor as early as possible to really maximize the amount of towers and phoenixes you can potentially use it at. Right, now let's talk about dual protections, because there's a couple of interesting choices. Now, Pridwin we've covered extensively. Do keep in mind, though, once again, that this shield of Pridwin that explodes, that is affected by protections. So if your victim has been hit by your ult, you're going to actually hit a little bit harder with this. So Pridwin is a great option here for a 4th item, just to keep you in mind, or a 3rd item if you built Emperor's Armor 2nd, or some other item 2nd. Great early item, but another really interesting option is, in fact, this Stone of Binding, because you can actually utilize this on an enemy, and while you're holding them, they're going to have their protections debuffed for the next 5 seconds, which is more than enough time for your hold, so while you're holding them, they have less protections. Now, this is a very specific scenario. It's up to you whether or not it's worth it, but it is a decent item nonetheless. I'm rather fond of that particular combination, in my personal opinion. I really don't recommend Manticore's spikes, though, because you do have only the one form of hard crowd control. You're only generating one spike. And you might be wondering, well, what's the difference? The difference is this actually physically drops. This happens automatically. You don't have to do anything else. And this provides 40 and with 250 health. This provides, yeah, sure, a little bit more health and mana, but it provides a little less of each protection, and again, there's the whole issue there of the one spike dropping. This theoretically also triggers off the slows. It doesn't here in jungle practice. I don't think it does in live matches that I could tell. That's probably a glitch. It's probably supposed to activate off of slows as well. If that's the case, as I suspect it's supposed to be, then even while you're doing your 50 billion slows, you can reduce their protections, and also this combos particularly well with your ult. You're already reducing their protections by percentage, and then you layer this flat reduction on top of that, and you're going to find that your allies are going to be absolutely slapping people in the time it takes to sizzle a burger, right? It's incredibly potent if combined well with your ult. So I'm also really fond of Stone of Binding as a 3rd or 4th item dual protections if you want that, right? Absolutely incredible. Now, I'm going to go on ahead and throw in Stone of Binding here just for the example. Now let's talk about magic protection items on Atlas. Now it goes without saying that obviously Shogun's Kusari is a fairly tasty treat. You get some cooldowns, you get your magic protections, you get some increased attack speed for your lovely pulsing. Right, but another great option is actually Talisman of Energy, which also provides allies with movement speed. And generally speaking, I personally prefer Talisman of Energy a little bit more. It combos extremely well with War Flag. It can really help you turn around and getting your team, again, closer to a jungle boss, or maybe pushing onto a Phoenix really quick. It's a lovely time. I'm really a big fan of Talisman of Energy as a magic protection item on him. Besides this, I really don't go for much else in terms of magic protections. It's either this or Shoguns. I very rarely build Pestilence because I rarely need that much anti-heal, let's be honest. And then finally we have Heartward Amulet, which of course you would build in a magic-heavy team composition. That goes without saying. It's a lovely time. I don't usually go for Winged Blade because obviously Kinetic Charge is just a better version of this, so there's really no point, right? But I am a huge fan of Talisman of Energy. Now let's talk about a couple of the other items really quick that you can finish the game off with. But let me talk about the damage items that I don't recommend. I'll talk about the glyphs really quick here. But I really don't recommend Gem of Isolation. This has been nerfed. This is not nearly as useful. And again, Unburden's Pulses don't trigger this. So, sure, it works with your ults, but you already have enough slows at that particular point, to be completely honest, where you really shouldn't need Gem of Isolation. So I generally give this a pass. Ethereal Staff doesn't do anything particularly special on Atlas any more than anyone else. If you like E-Staff and you like Atlas, go for the build. You know, throw this on as the last item, but I wouldn't build it any earlier than the last item because I think it's not going to give you enough protections until then, right? I don't generally build Spear the Magus either, although it does combo well with his ult. I have built it on occasion and found it very useful in those situations, but again, please keep in mind that Unburden's Pulses don't trigger this, alright? It can be really potent and very effective. I just don't find myself wanting it very often. With the 10% magical penetration that it offers, maybe it's a bit more viable now for Atlas. I need to test this a bit more thoroughly before making that concrete. but it can be a good item. Another interesting item to build on him, actually, though, is very specifically Pythagoras' Piece or Soul Gem. Right, not really so much Soul Gem in this particular case because you don't really have a lot of magic power. This is a little bit better on Jungle Atlas, which I'll talk about in a future date. But I'll tell you what, Pythagoras' Piece works extremely well with the ult of Atlas because you get to increase your allies' power even as you're reducing enemies' protections, which means your allies are hitting even harder than they normally would. This also gives you some nice cooldowns, which is never a bad thing. So Pythagoras' Piece is actually a really strong damage item to build on at the end game as well, if you're really into that. Again, Spirit of the Magus also makes for a great choice if you want it, right? Lovely time. Now, finally, before I move off of damage items, and I use that term loosely, whenever I need anti-healing, I'm usually going to go for Toxic Blade if the enemy team has enough auto-attackers, because enemies hit by your basic attacks, right? Remember, again, that your Astrolabe special auto-attack hits twice by definition, by technical definition, so you can actually build 2 Toxic Blade stacks in a single go if you time that right. Right? You can also hit multiple targets with that auto attack, which means you can start stacking on multiple enemies all at the same time, which can help you a lot in the terms of survivability, right? Keep in mind, once again, that if you actually grab onto someone, you're basically going to be a miniature sitting duck for a little while, which is a risky thing to have happen to you, so reducing attack speed like that is a fairly nice thing, alright? Now, to talk a bit more about physical protections, there are a couple of other items I'm really fond of. Midgardian Mail, once again, for similar reasons of Toxic Blade, but at that point I'm probably going to build Toxic Blade anyways, because, let's be really honest, if the enemy team, if the enemy ADC has Devourer's Gauntlet, you're going to want to reduce that anyways, that healing anyways, so whenever I need to reduce attack speed, my go-to currently is Toxic Blade, at least for Atlas as of the most recent update. But there are a couple of other options. Now, I really don't need to talk about Sovereignty too much. We all know it's really good against the physical heavy comps, standard stuff. But, of course, as a reminder on Mystical Mail, this damage is also tied to enemy protections. The higher their protections, the less damage this does, which means while you're in your ult, the more damage this will do because their protections are reduced. So it's a really nice thing to just kind of keep in mind. If you really, for some bizarre reason, want to deal extra damage with Gladiator's Shield, you can. It's not a bad item by any stretch of the imagination. Again, this is also affected by protections, so this also works really well with his ult. Berserker's Shield is more about the attack speed, which he doesn't need quite as much of, to be honest. Most of his energy comes from abilities, so I've never built this on him, but in theory you could. If you're not building Toxic Blade and you want anti-healing, I do recommend Contagion, because that second passive there, when you are hit by hard crowd control, the enemy receives an aura that deals 40 magic damage per second to them and other enemies. Right? Again, this is magic damage, this is not true damage, it is affected by protections, so therefore, this damage will be a little bit more impactful under the influence of your ult. Right? It's a lovely time, and it's a really great item to build. As for the cloaks, pretty much all of these can work if you really want to have one of these. It's fine. Again, my favorite is Prophetic Cloak, but that's personal preference, at least for Conquest. But all of these cloaks work in their own way. Nothing particularly stand out here. You've got, the usual... there's nothing that these do particularly well for Atlas that bears really any merit for talking about. They're just really strong dual protection items, usually with some cooldowns. Right? But with that all being said, if I wanted to, I'm going to go on ahead and continue my trend where I generally encourage people to build a single item of damage at the end. Now, if you are running Prophetic Cloak, you really don't want to be running some damage at the end, obviously, because you want to have that evolve and get the increased mitigations if you have over 600 total, which is very easy to get, right? I mean, in this particular case, I don't have War Flag, so my protections are slightly too low, but it's not terribly difficult to get to the 300, and if you have Prophetic Cloak, you really don't want to be throwing on any end-game damage. You're going to want to double down on those protections, but, you always have that option. I'm really a big fan of Pythagoras' Piece, personally. On Atlas, we're providing cooldowns, we're providing damage, we're providing lifesteal. Failing that, I am very partial to, a lot of the times, Gladiator's Shield, if there's a lot of magic enemies, right, where I wouldn't obviously be building that. I'm generally going to go down and grab Shogun's Kusari on top of the Talisman of Energy if I really need it. It really depends. I don't really build anything out of this tree other than the occasional Gauntlet of Thebes. But, yeah, this is generally speaking how I approach building Atlas, at least in terms of the support role. Alright, really quickly before we end, I did want to talk about shards really quick, because the shards are something really particularly early. I'm really fond of the Carapace shard, because if you actually pay attention to the timing of this, behold, I activate the shard, hit the auto attack, pull them in, boom. As the effect ends, I'm popping them out, right? So Carapace shard can operate very similarly to Stone of Binding, where it's reducing their protections while they're held basically in your Astrolabe. The only real difference here is that this is a potentially slightly stronger effect compared to the Carapace shell, or Carapace shard, right? The rest of them I'm not really as big of a fan of. I think Carapace shard is the best because you can basically force that enemy to take all that damage, which is a really huge benefit there. But yeah, that's pretty much where I take Atlas in most cases. Alright? At least as a support. So, kept it to the point. Didn't waste time. For once. Amen. With that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.